Every empire was built on a story. This season investigates the ones that wore the face of God. Here's the first thing you need to know. The phrase, 1000-Year Reich, 1000-Jähriges Reich, doesn't appear anywhere in Mein Kampf. It's not in the Nazi Party's founding documents. It wasn't part of Hitler's vocabulary when he started. He borrowed it in 1934, 10 years into his political career. Why then? Why that phrase? Because in 1934, Hitler had just become both Chancellor and President. He had consolidated power. The emergency was over, or at least, that's what it looked like. And he needed a different answer to the question every government eventually has to answer. What is all of this for? Economic recovery is a good answer, but it's a fragile one. If the numbers turn bad, the justification disappears. Hitler needed something that couldn't be disproved by a bad harvest or a rising unemployment rate. He needed a prophecy, not a political program, not a 5-year plan, a 1000-year destiny. The Third Reich lasted 12 years, and not on scale. The Holocaust was not the work of a small group of fanatics acting over the heads of an oblivious population. It required the active participation of hundreds of thousands of Germans and the at minimum passive compliance of millions more. The trains had to run. The paperwork had to be filed. The guards had to report for duty. The neighbors had to not call attention to what they saw or didn't see. The bureaucrats had to process the forms that organized the transportation of millions of people to their deaths. Christopher Browning's study, Ordinary Men, about Reserve Police Battalion 101. A group of middle-aged German men who became killing units in occupied Poland shows that most of them were not ideological fanatics. They were ordinary people. Many of them had not been members of the Nazi Party before the war. When their commander offered, at the outset of their first mass execution, to excuse anyone who didn't want to participate, only a handful of the 500 men stepped aside. The others killed because their comrades were killing, because refusing felt like abandoning their unit, because the situation had been structured in a way that made killing the path of least resistance. The 1000-Year Reich didn't need everyone to be a true believer. It needed a structure in which compliance was easier than refusal, and it built that structure with extraordinary care. In those 12 years, it killed 6 million Jews in a systematic industrial genocide with no precedent in recorded history. It killed 17 to 20 million Soviet civilians. It killed 6 million more Poles, Roma, disabled people, gay men, political prisoners, anyone it had decided didn't deserve to exist. It started a war that killed between 70 and 85 million people in total. 12 years for something that called itself the 1000-Year Reich. This episode isn't about the atrocities. Those are documented, and they don't need us to amplify them. This episode is about the machinery underneath. How do you make millions of people believe that mass murder is destiny, that a war of conquest is the completion of history, that what you're doing isn't a choice but a fulfillment of something written 1,000 years before you were born? That's what we're here for. Not the horror. The mechanism that made the horror feel inevitable. The idea of a Third Reich didn't start in Germany. It started in a monastery in southern Italy in the 12th century. A monk named Joachim Fiore spent decades working out a theory of history. His argument, simplified, history moves in 3 ages. The age of the Father, the Old Testament, God as law, God as fear. The age of the Son, the New Testament, God as grace, God through the Church. And the third age, the age of the Holy Spirit, when everything before it would be completed. No more church hierarchy. No more intermediaries. Direct relationship with God. The reason this structure keeps reappearing across different cultures and centuries isn't because later movements read Joachim's actual texts. Most of them didn't. It's because the three-stage structure maps onto something fundamental in how human beings organize meaning. Setup, complication, resolution, genesis, fall, redemption, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The story of history moving toward a destination is just a good story. And when you plug a political movement into that structure, you're plugging it into the most powerful narrative engine available. You're not just a German. You're a German alive at the moment. German history completes itself. And that's a hard offer to refuse, especially when you've spent 10 years in economic catastrophe, especially when the alternative liberal democracy, pluralistic debate, individual rights feels like the system that produced the catastrophe in the first place. He thought it was coming around 1260. He was wrong about the timing, but the structure stuck. Within decades, different groups were using Joachim's framework to argue that they were the vanguard of the Third Age, that their movement, their order, their sect, their cause was the beginning of the final chapter of history. Dan to put Joachim in paradise. The idea kept spreading. Why? Why does this structure keep getting reused? Because it solves a specific psychological problem. When you tell people they're living through the Third Age, the final age, the age of completion, you answer the hardest question any movement faces. Why now? Why us? Why is what we're doing different from everything that came before? The answer is, because history has been building to this moment, and we are the people it's been building toward. In the German imagination, the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years of German-speaking peoples at the center of European civilization. From Charlemagne's coronation in 800 CE to Napoleon's forced dissolution in 1806, the Second Reich was the German Empire of 1871, Bismarck's unified Germany, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles after crushing France. That one lasted 47 years and ended in military defeat in 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory, imposed massive reparations, and assigned Germany sole guilt for the war. So beide Seats deviates at the Devatset. The German political right has a story. Two great German empires. Both ended in collapse. Both lost, one to a Frenchman, one to betrayal from within. And the wounds are still raw. That's the gap. That's what the Third Reich was designed to fill. In 1923, a German cultural critic named Arthur Mohle van den Broek published a book. The title, Das Dritte Reich, The Third Reich. Mohle van den Broek wasn't a Nazi. He wasn't a street fighter or a demagogue. He was an intellectual, a man who had spent his career translating Dostoevsky into German and writing about the soul of Western civilization. His argument, in the book, Germany's problem wasn't political. It wasn't economic. It was spiritual. Germany had lost the war because it had lost its sense of who it was. The Third Reich he was describing wasn't a government. It was a national spiritual awakening. The beer hall putsch happened in November 1923, the same year Das Dritte Reich was published. The same year Germany's hyperinflation peaked and the middle class watched their savings evaporate. Hitler and the Nazi Party tried to seize power in Munich, starting from a beer hall where a major state government meeting was taking place. The putsch failed within hours. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years for treason. He served 8 months. He used the time to dictate Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. The lesson he took from the failure was tactical. The path to power was through elections, not coup. You could use democratic institutions to destroy democracy, win your way in, and then refuse to leave. In 1928, the Nazis won 6% of the vote. In July 1932, 37%. January 30, 1933. Hitler becomes Chancellor, not seized. Voted in, inside legal norms. Right up until the Enabling Act in March, 1933 gave him legislative authority without the Reichstag. The Thousand-Year Reich wasn't a coup. It was a democratic election result followed by a legal power grab. That's a more uncomfortable history than the simple story of a madman seizing control. He died by suicide in 1925, 2 years after his book came out, before Hitler came to power, before he could see what was done with his title. He gave the phrase to German political culture. He didn't live to watch it being used. The conservative revolution the intellectual movement Mohle van den Bruck belonged to included several other important figures worth knowing. Carl Schmitt, the legal theorist, provided the theoretical frameworks for emergency rule and the suspension of constitutional protections. He argued that sovereignty is defined by the power to declare exceptions to normal law, that the truly sovereign entity is the one that decides when the rules don't apply. Hitler found this useful. Schmitt joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and became known as the crown jurist of the Third Reich, before eventually falling out of favor with the SS in 1936. Oswald Spengler, whose Decline of the West had argued that Western civilization was in terminal decline and that a new political form was needed, died in 1936, having concluded that Hitler was not the Caesar. He had been describing something cruder and more dangerous. Ernst Jünger, who had written about World War I in terms that aestheticized combat, never fully joined the party and survived with a deliberately ambiguous record. The pattern repeats across every case this season covers. The intellectuals supply the frame. The movement fills it with something the intellectuals didn't put there. And then the intellectuals spend the rest of their lives arguing that the frame was innocent. Now here's the important distinction. Hitler read the phrase or absorbed it from the political atmosphere of Munich in the early 1920s and understood something Mohle van den Bruck hadn't intended. He understood that the eschatological structure was the useful part. The 3 H's. The third and final completion. The idea of a people standing at the culmination of their history. The theology could be stripped out. The racial mysticism could be poured in. Mohle van den Bruck had been writing philosophy. Hitler was looking for a weapon. He took the frame and refilled it. To understand why the Thousand-Year Reich worked as a political offer, you need to understand what Germany was in 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor. The Weimar Republic had been running since 1919. In some ways it was a remarkable democracy, proportional representation. Strong civil liberties, a genuinely pluralistic culture. In the same decade you got the Nazi Party growing in Munich. You got Einstein in Berlin, and Brecht in the theaters, and Fritz Lang making Metropolis. But the democracy was under siege from day one. The hyperinflation of 1923 wiped out the savings of an entire generation of the middle class. People who had worked for decades, built something modest, had it evaporate. Not devalued, evaporated. Then, before Germany had fully recovered, the Great Depression hit in 1929. By 1932, German unemployment was 30%. The political system was paralyzed. The Reichstag couldn't form stable governments. The parties were too fragmented, too ideologically incompatible. 6 chancellors in 3 years. Here's a detail that tends to get lost in the standard account of Nazi rise to power. The economic recovery was real. By 1936, German unemployment had fallen from 30% to under 5%. Real wages were rising. The Autobahn was being built. Major infrastructure projects were employing hundreds of thousands of people. Germany was hosting the 936 Olympics, I'm presenting to an international audience a modern, prosperous, orderly nation. The 1936 Berlin Olympics deserve a note here because they're the clearest single example of the regime managing international perception at scale. Hitler had initially been advised by Goebbels to exclude Jewish and black athletes from competing. He overruled this. The Olympics were too visible, the international audience too large, the reputational cost too high. So for 2 weeks in August 1936, Germany presented to the world a version of itself that was modern, orderly, welcoming, a National Socialist only in the background. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. Hitler refused to publicly congratulate him. He had congratulated German and Finnish athletes the day before and was advised by Olympic officials to either congratulate all winners publicly or none. He chose none and left the stadium before the ceremony. The American press reported this as a snub. Owens himself said later that it was President Roosevelt who snubbed him. FDR never sent a telegram of congratulations, never invited him to the White House. The optics of the Olympics, from multiple angles, were more complicated than the simple story of Hitler embarrassed by a black athlete. But for the German public, the Olympics confirmed the narrative. Germany was back. Germany was hosting the world. The 1,000-year Reich was a country the world came to visit. How was this possible? Adam Tooze, whose history of the Nazi economy is the standard scholarly account, argues that it was possible primarily because Germany was running massive deficit spending, borrowing at a rate that could not be sustained without expansion. The rearmament that was putting people to work was also building a military that would eventually need to be used to acquire the resources the debt required. The economic recovery and the war of conquest were not separate things. They were the same thing at different stages of the same process. But in 1936, the debt wasn't visible. What was visible was the jobs, the wages, the pride, the sense of a country that had been humiliated and was now standing up. The people who had watched their savings evaporate in 1923 and their livelihoods disappear in 1929 were now working. Their children were in the Hitler Youth, which gave them purpose and community and a sense of belonging to something larger than the poverty and chaos of the previous decade. The 1,000-year Reich was the story that organized all of this into a coherent narrative. The recovery wasn't just economic. It was the first stage of the fulfillment of a 1,000-year destiny. The jobs and the wages were not merely material goods. They were confirmation that Germany was on the right side of history. This is why economic performance alone can't explain support for the regime. It contributed. But the regime's support didn't collapse when the economy turned bad, didn't collapse even after Stalingrad, even after the Allied bombing began, even as the physical destruction of the country became undeniable. The providential narrative had been embedded deeply enough that it could survive a deteriorating material situation in a way that a purely economic justification cannot. You can't bomb a destiny. The center was not holding. Hitler's initial offer was simple: order, work, dignity, Autobahn construction, rearmament, reversing the humiliations of Versailles. And these deliverables were real. Unemployment did fall. And quickly. The German economy recovered faster than almost anywhere else in the Western world. But then the practical offer runs into its own limitation. Economic recovery is great, but what do you do when the recovery is complete? What's the vision after the crisis ends? That's where the 1,000-year Reich comes in. The Weimar Republic that produced the Nazis also produced the Bauhaus. Expressionism. Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Brecht in the theaters. Einstein was in Berlin. Heisenberg and Schrödinger were developing quantum mechanics. The country that voted the 1,000-year Reich into existence was simultaneously one of the most culturally and intellectually dynamic societies on Earth. Cultural sophistication is not a defense against the mechanism. Sometimes it is a resource for it. Sebastian Haffner describes the moment he identified, in retrospect, as the central failure. He was studying law in 1933, in a library, when SA men came in and checked identity papers and ordered the Jewish law students to leave. They left. The non-Jewish students, including Haffner, stayed. And then, he writes, he went back to his notes. That moment, the return to the notes became for him the symbol of how the mechanism works on ordinary people. Not dramatic conversion, the accumulation of small acceptances, each one making the next easier. Until you look up and you are somewhere that would have been unthinkable when you started. It's not economic policy. Its meaning is the answer to all of this hardship, all of this sacrifice, all of this what's it for? What are we building toward? 1,000 years. Not a government, a destiny. And here's the specific political genius of the phrase. A government that justifies itself on economic competence can be voted out when the economy turns bad. A government that justifies itself on historical destiny, on being the fulfillment of a 1,000-year prophecy, can't be held accountable by the ordinary measures of political performance. If something goes wrong, it's a test, a setback on the road to fulfillment. The enemies of the German people working against Germany's destiny. If something goes right, it's confirmation. Providence is working. The claim is unfalsifiable. That's the point of making it. Otto Strasser, a Nazi official who later broke with Hitler, left an account of a meeting between Hitler and Moller van den Broek in Munich in 1922. Whether the exact meeting happened as Strasser described it is disputed by historians. But the substance is clear. Hitler was aware of the concept before he used it. It was in the political atmosphere of the city. He found the phrase that was already there and understood what it could do. The beer hall putsch happened in November 1923, the same year Das Dritte Reich was published. The same year the hyperinflation peaked. Hitler and the Nazi Party attempted to seize power in Munich, starting from a beer hall where a major Bavarian government meeting was taking place. The putsch failed within hours. The army refused to support it. The police opened fire on the marchers. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. He served 8 months. He used the time to dictate Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. The book is badly written, repetitive, rambling, full of the rhetorical patterns of spoken agitation rather than the structured argument of a written text. But it's so. After Hitler became chancellor in 1933, it became mandatory reading in schools and a standard wedding gift from municipal governments. (1945). Approximately 12 million copies had been sold or distributed in Germany, nearly 1 per household. The lesson Hitler took from the failed putsch was tactical rather than ideological. The path to power was through elections, and not coup. Democratic institutions could be used to destroy democracy. You could win your way into power and then refuse to leave. He spent the next decade building the party organization that would execute this strategy. In 1928, the Nazis won 6% of the vote. In 1932, they won 37%. By January 1933, they were the largest party in the Reichstag, and Hitler was chancellor. The 1,000-year Reich was not seized. It was voted in. That distinction matters for understanding why it was so difficult to stop from the inside. Moller van den Broek wrote a book. Hitler wrote a movement. The phrase belonged to both of them, and to neither. Albert Speer was 28 years old when Hitler first saw his work and asked him to redesign the Nuremberg rally grounds. 28. He was a recent architecture school graduate who'd been doing interior decoration, redesigning a few rooms in the propaganda ministry, building a speaker's platform for a Berlin rally. No experience at any scale resembling what Hitler was about to ask for. But Speer understood something that mattered more than experience. He understood what the scale was for. The Zeppelin field, as Speer designed it, held 340,000 people. The grandstand was modeled on an ancient Greek altar, the Pergamon altar, a 2nd century BCE monument the Germans had excavated in Turkey in the 1870s and transported to Berlin. The original altar depicted the battle between the gods and the giants, with the gods winning. Hitler had visited it in the museum. Why does this matter? Because the choice of model was a statement. You're not designing a political venue. You're designing a sacred space. You're saying, what happens here is not a party meeting. It is a cosmic event. The architecture was theology built in stone. For the 1934 rally, Speer took every anti-aircraft searchlight available in Germany, 130 of them, and arranged them around the perimeter of the field, pointing straight up. When they switched on at dusk, the beams rose into the clouds and appeared to merge into a glowing ceiling several kilometers above. From inside, you were standing in a cathedral made of light, walls of light, a ceiling of light, and at the altar, the figure of the Führer. The British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, attended the 1937 rally. He wrote afterward that he had spent 6 years in St. Petersburg in the golden age of Russian ballet and for grandiose beauty. He had never seen anything to compare with what Speer had built at Nuremberg. He was describing a political rally. He experienced it as art. That's the point. That's what Speer built. Not a venue for a speech. An experience that bypassed the analytical mind entirely and went straight to awe. Leni Riefenstahl was 31 when she made Triumph of the Will. She'd been an actress and dancer before becoming a filmmaker. Hitler saw her debut film and called it his favorite German movie. He gave her unlimited resources and creative control for the 1934 rally. She brought 170 crew and 30 cameras. She had a camera elevator installed inside a flagpole. She had railway tracks laid along the grandstand for smooth tracking shots. She used 135,000 feet of film. The editing took 5 months. The result was technically revolutionary. Film scholars have been analyzing it for 80 years. But here's the question that still generates debate. Did Riefenstahl film the rally? Or did the rally exist in order to be filmed? The Cathedral of Light was positioned with her camera angles in mind. The march past choreography was adjusted around her placements. The event and the film weren't separate, they were designed together. The rally was, in significant part, a production for Riefenstahl's cameras. The opening sequence is 30 seconds of footage with no narration. Hitler's plane descends through clouds over the city. The camera looks down from the plane at the crowds marching below. Then the plane's shadow crosses over them. The Führer's shadow arrives before he does. Think about what that image is saying. Descent from the clouds. Shadow preceding arrival. This is the visual grammar of divine descent. It's not subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The film made a theological argument in pure image. Riefenstahl spent the rest of her life insisting she had made an apolitical document of an event, not propaganda. She lived to 101, dying in 2003. For 6 decades, she argued that her artistic intentions and the political use of her work were separate things. Most historians don't accept the separation, but it's worth sitting with it, because it reveals how the mechanism works for the people inside it. Riefenstahl was a genuine artist. Her technical innovations were real. Her aesthetic instincts were sophisticated. She wasn't a functionary executing a political order, she was a filmmaker, making choices she found beautiful. And those beautiful choices served one of the most destructive regimes in history with extraordinary efficiency. The mechanism doesn't require bad faith from the people who serve it. It often runs better on genuine conviction. Speer believed he was building great architecture. Riefenstahl believed she was making great film. The mechanism was using their genuine commitments as fuel. The best evidence for when German popular belief began to genuinely erode Gestapo reports on public mood. Postal surveillance records. Private diaries suggest the shift was gradual through 1943 and 1944, and accelerated specifically when Allied bombing brought the war to German cities. The Hamburg firestorm of July, 1,943 killed, approximately 37,000 people in a single week. The war that had been happening to other people for 4 years suddenly happened to Germans. That physical arrival changed the texture of belief faster than any battlefield defeat had. You can maintain a prophetic narrative about distant catastrophe. It is harder to maintain it when the house next door is burning. Speer was the only major Nuremberg defendant who expressed remorse and accepted partial responsibility. He was sentenced to 20 years instead of execution. Historians have since noted that other defendants were often more candid in private about what they had done, and why Speer's remorse was calibrated to the audience in a way that served his interests. Gitta Serena, who interviewed him extensively, concluded that his central post-war project was not understanding what he had done but constructing a version of himself that could survive the understanding. He died in 1981 with a reputation as the good Nazi. Most historians today don't accept that the category exists. Christopher Browning's study, Ordinary Men, documents Reserve Police Battalion 101, a group of middle-aged German men, not ideological fanatics. Most of them not Nazi Party members before the war, who became killing units in occupied Poland in 1942. Their commander told them at the outset of their first mass execution that anyone who didn't want to participate could step aside. A handful did. The rest killed. Browning's argument is that most of them killed not because of deep ideological conviction, but because of the social pressure of the situation. Their comrades were killing. Refusing felt like abandoning their unit. The act had been defined, through years of propaganda, as a legitimate function, not murder, but the fulfillment of a national mission. The situation had been structured to make killing the path of least resistance. The 1,000-year Reich didn't need everyone to be a true believer. It needed a structure in which compliance was easier than refusal, and it built that structure with extraordinary care over 12 years. This is what makes the Holocaust so resistant to simple explanation. It was not produced only by fanatics. It was produced by a society in which the prophetic narrative had been embedded deeply enough, and the social and institutional structures had been arranged carefully enough. That ordinary behavior, following orders, keeping up with your colleagues, not being the one who causes trouble, led to extraordinary evil. The prophecy didn't require everyone to believe it. It just had to make non-belief more costly than belief. Riefenstahl spent the rest of her life, and she lived to be 101. Dying in 2003, insisting that she had made an apolitical document of an event, not a piece of propaganda. She acknowledged the film served the regime's purposes. She denied that was her intention. The defense doesn't hold, and most film historians don't accept it. But it's worth sitting with the claim for a moment, because it reveals something about how the mechanism works for the people inside it. Riefenstahl was a genuine artist. Her technical innovations were real. Her aesthetic instincts were sophisticated. She wasn't a bureaucrat filling a political order, she was a filmmaker making choices she found beautiful and compelling. And those beautiful, compelling choices served one of the most destructive regimes in history with extraordinary efficiency. A mechanism doesn't require bad faith from the people who serve it. It often runs better on genuine conviction. Speer believed he was building great architecture. Riefenstahl believed she was making great film. Klemperer's colleagues who stayed in their jobs at the university believed they were maintaining scholarly integrity. Melita Marschmann believed she was building a better Germany for her generation. The mechanism was running through all of them, using their genuine commitments as fuel. The visual grammar Riefenstahl developed at Nuremberg, the low angle, the synchronized crowd, the face-to-mass alternation. The sense of individual feeling validated by collective feeling is now the default grammar of political spectacle worldwide. It's in every party convention. It's in Olympic ceremonies. It's in corporate product launches that fill stadiums. The aesthetic form that was built to produce devotion to a 1,000-year empire has been so thoroughly integrated into the visual culture of commercial democracy that most people who encounter it have no idea it has an origin. The mechanism doesn't need the ideology to survive. It just needs the feeling, and the feeling travels independent of the specific content it was built to carry. One specific example of the grammar surviving its context: the way political candidates enter arenas in contemporary campaigns, the walkout music, the spotlight tracking a single figure through a crowd, the camera angle from below looking up at the approaching stage, the slow pan across faces turned uniformly toward the same point. Every element of this sequence has a name in Riefenstahl's vocabulary. None of the campaigns deploying it acknowledge the origin. Most voters experiencing it don't know there is one. This isn't a conspiracy. Nobody is deliberately deploying Nazi aesthetics in modern democratic politics. It's the natural diffusion of effective technique through culture, the way successful innovations spread regardless of their origin. The visual grammar that was built to produce devotion to a 1,000-year empire has been so thoroughly integrated into the visual culture of commercial democracy that it's now just how you do things. The Cathedral of Light has been democratized. Its architect is forgotten. Its grammar is everywhere. No words needed. Viktor Klemperer was a literature professor in Dresden, Jewish by ancestry. Though he had converted to Protestantism decades earlier, a distinction that meant nothing to the Nuremberg laws, which defined Jewishness by blood, not belief. He was stripped of his professorship, subjected to escalating restrictions, eventually moved into a Jew's house in the city. His non-Jewish wife Eva refused to leave him. That decision probably saved his life. Klemperer kept two things during those years: a diary, which documented what was happening around him day by day, and a linguistic notebook. He called it LTI Lingua Tertimperi, the language of the Third Reich. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, 2 years after Hitler became Chancellor, stripped German Jews of citizenship and banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews. They defined Jewishness by ancestry. 3 or more Jewish grandparents made you legally Jewish, regardless of your religion, your self-identification, or how long your family had been in Germany. Klemperer's conversion to Protestantism was legally irrelevant. His wife Eva's non-Jewish ancestry was legally irrelevant to his status. He was Jewish. She was not. She stayed anyway. The specific details of what Klemperer's life became between 1935 and 1945 are documented in his diaries with a precision that is both extraordinary and devastating. Banned from libraries, banned from cinemas, required to wear the yellow star, required to surrender his typewriter, his car, his radio, moved through progressively worse housing as the city's Jewish population was concentrated. All of this while remaining, internally, a professor of literature continuing to take notes, to analyze, to write, because writing was how he processed what was happening around him. The regime was built on a prophecy. Klemperer watched the language of that prophecy from inside the population the prophecy had designated for elimination. He catalogued it, He survived to publish it. He was a philologist, a man whose professional life had been dedicated to understanding how language worked. And what he observed from inside the Nazi state was this: the regime wasn't only changing laws, it was changing words. One example: the word fanatis, fanatical, in normal German, as in normal English. That's a criticism. A fanatical person has lost perspective. They've let their belief override their judgment. In Nazi usage, Klemperer noticed the word had flipped. Fanatical was now a compliment. The highest compliment. To be fanatically devoted to the Führer was to be fully, completely, authentically German. Reason was the limitation. Fanaticism was the liberation. They didn't just change the law. They changed the inside of people's heads. The word folk people was loaded with racial mysticism until it no longer meant a demographic group. It meant a community of blood and destiny that could be purified or contaminated. The word Schicksal, fate, or destiny showed up in Hitler's speeches constantly, connecting ordinary events to the cosmic narrative of German historical mission. Klemperer called it the poisoning of language. His argument: if you change the words people use to think, you change what thoughts are possible. The walls weren't only being built outside, they were being built inside people's minds, in the language they used to talk to themselves. Here are 3 specific examples from Klemperer's notebook. The word fanatisch, fanatical, flipped from insult to compliment. The word historic was applied to everything, making genuine significance indistinguishable from routine announcement. And the prefix Sturm was attached to everything: Sturmabteilung, Sturmgewehr, Sturmtruppen, Sturmdivision, Sturmrifle, Stormtroops. The regime wanted its language to feel like weather, inevitable, natural, something that happens to you rather than something people choose to do. Klemperer published his linguistic notebook in 1947. He framed it as a warning rather than a historical document. His argument: what the Nazis did to German, any ideology can do to any language. Given the same deliberate effort to control the vocabulary in which people think, he wasn't describing something uniquely German. He was describing a technique, one that could be reproduced. He survived because his wife refused to leave, and because the Allied bombing of Dresden on February 13, 1945, which killed 25,000 people, created enough administrative chaos that the deportation orders already issued for the remaining Jews in the city were lost in the rubble. He was on the list. The bombing saved him. He died in 1960. His diaries weren't published in full until 1995. When they appeared, they became one of the most widely read documents of the Nazi period in Germany, not for heroism, but for the specificity of watching. The 1,000-Year Reich was a linguistic construction as much as a political one. By 1939, the Hitler Youth had enrolled approximately 8 million young Germans, about 90% of the eligible population. Membership had been made compulsory in 1936. Melita Maschmann was 17 years old on the night Hitler became Chancellor. She watched the torchlight parade through Berlin and felt, as she described it decades later, that something transformative was happening that she wanted to be part of. Her parents were skeptical conservatives who didn't support the Nazis. She joined the BDM secretly. That night, she wrote about it in a memoir called Account Rendered, addressed as a letter to a Jewish school friend she had refused to see after 1933. She describes the Hitler Youth not primarily as a propaganda operation but as a community, a place where the loneliness of adolescence dissolved into collective purpose, where individual anxieties became irrelevant against the backdrop of a national mission where everyone had a role. Was she brainwashed? Was she manipulated? Yes. And also, the community was real. The belonging was real. The ideology that organized the community was inseparable from the belonging. You couldn't have one without the other. That's what makes it hard. The mechanism worked partly because it was offering something genuine and then attaching that genuine thing to something monstrous. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, wrote that he had never fully absorbed the content of Hitler's speeches, that the physical experience of the rallies reached him before the meaning. He felt the speeches before he understood them. He described standing inside Speer's own lichdom, his own creation, and feeling something he could only describe as awe. Multiple eyewitnesses from the period described the same thing. The scale, the light, the synchronized movement, the music producing an emotional state in which the content of what was being said became almost secondary. You were already feeling the truth of it before the argument was made. That's the aesthetic function of the 1,000-year Reich. Not to convince, to induce. Susan Sontag, writing about Triumph of the Will in 1975, identified the visual grammar that Riefenstahl had created or refined at Nuremberg, the low angle that makes ordinary people look heroic, the extreme telephoto that compresses a crowd into a sea of faces, the synchronized movement of large groups filmed from above so the pattern becomes visible, the counterpoint of intimate close-up and spectacular wide shot. All of this was at Nuremberg in 1934. And it is now in every political convention film, every Olympic opening ceremony, every major commercial advertising campaign. The aesthetic grammar of the 1,000-year Reich has been running through Western visual culture for 80 years. Most people who encounter it have no idea where it came from. The mechanism doesn't need the ideology to survive. One more example of the grammar surviving its context: the way political candidates enter arenas in contemporary campaigns. The walkout music. The spotlights tracking a single figure through a crowd. The crowd noise building. The camera angle from below, looking up at the figure approaching the stage. A slow pan across faces in the crowd that are turned uniformly toward the same point. Every element of this has a name in Riefenstahl's vocabulary. None of the campaigns deploying it acknowledge the origin. Most of the voters experiencing it don't know there is one. This isn't a conspiracy. Nobody is deliberately deploying Nazi aesthetics in modern democratic politics. It's the natural diffusion of effective techniques through a culture, the way successful innovations spread regardless of their origin. Riefenstahl's visual grammar works. It produces the feeling of collective purpose and individual validation. It works for Democrats and Republicans and every other party that uses arenas and spotlights and walkout music. The mechanism has been laundered through 80 years of commercial use until it's just how you do things. It just needs the feeling. And the feeling travels. By 1936. The architecture of belief was essentially complete. The legal structure was in place. The aesthetic infrastructure was running at full capacity. The schools were capturing the next generation. The economic recovery was real enough to look like confirmation. The 1936 Berlin Olympics deserve a moment because they represent the regime's most successful international presentation of itself. Goebbels had initially argued for excluding Jewish and black athletes. Hitler overruled it. The audience was too large. The reputational cost too high. For 2 weeks in August 1936, Germany presented a version of itself that was modern, orderly, and welcoming. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. Hitler left the stadium before the American medal ceremonies after being told by Olympic officials to either congratulate all winners publicly or none. Owens said later it was President Roosevelt who actually snubbed him. FDR never sent a telegram, never invited him to the White House. The story of Hitler embarrassed by a black athlete is simpler and more satisfying than the actual record. For the German public, the Olympics confirmed the narrative. Germany was back. The world was coming to Germany. The 1,000-year Reich was a host nation. 3 years later, Germany invaded Poland and the war began. But in August 1936, to a German public that had spent a decade in humiliation and economic catastrophe, the Olympics looked like exactly what the prophecy had promised. Germany, restored, at the center of the world. What hadn't been tested was what happened when the prophecy met a wall. That test was called Stalingrad. August 23, 1824, the German Sixth Army reaches the Volga River. This is the furthest east any German force has ever been. The Volga, the great river of Russia. The artery running from the center of the country to the Caspian Sea is now within sight. Hitler is at his forward headquarters in Ukraine. He is in an unusually good mood. He tells his generals the Soviet Union is finished. The war in the East will be over before winter. His generals are less sure. Several of them are writing in their diaries about supply lines that are dangerously extended, about Soviet resistance that is harder than expected, about an army that doesn't have the reserves to sustain operations at this pace. Hitler overrules them. He has the certainty of a man who believes history is working with him, not against him. This certainty is about to be tested. On November 17, 1824, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. They hit the weaker Romanian armies holding the flanks of the German position at Stalingrad. The Romanians had been warning for weeks that they couldn't hold against a major attack. Within 4 days, the encirclement was complete. Sambai Senshu. 000 German soldiers were surrounded. The military logic of what to do next was clear to almost every senior commander involved. Break out. Now. The pocket was still thin enough to penetrate. General von Manstein urged it. Paulus's own staff urged it. The arithmetic of supply made it obvious the Sixth Army needed 750 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could deliver. At best. 100 tons. The math said the army would starve before spring. Hitler refused. His refusal wasn't primarily strategic. It was theological. Stalingrad had become, in Nazi propaganda, the symbol of German advance, the place where the 1,000-year Reich had reached the Volga, the edge of the Eurasian continent. To retreat from Stalingrad was to admit the prophecy could go backward, and prophecies don't go backward. He told Paulus to hold. He told him a relief force was coming. He promoted him to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German military, a rank that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered from. Paulus understood the message. Hold, or die trying. The last Luftwaffe supply flights out of the pocket. In January 1943, carried mail, letters home from the men inside. The Wehrmacht Psychological Research Office collected them, read them, and classified a significant portion of them because their content was damaging to the official narrative. They weren't the letters of men dying heroically for the prophecy. One soldier wrote to his parents, "We have been left here. I do not know if there is a reason that history will recognize, but I know that the reason has not reached us here." Another wrote to his wife, "I thought we were the vanguard of something. I am no longer sure what." A committed party member wrote, "They told us this was necessary. I can no longer find the necessity in what I see around me." These men weren't abandoning Germany. They were noting that the prophecy hadn't arrived, and the state suppressed their observations. Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1824, the first German field marshal in history to be taken prisoner. Of the 330,000 men who had been surrounded 3 months earlier, approximately 91,000 survived to march into Soviet captivity. Of those 91, Ling ling ling. Approximately 6,000 would live to return to Germany. The German public hadn't been told what was actually happening. The word Kessel, cauldron, the military term for an encircled force, had been banned from public use. Official communiques described tactical repositioning. When the surrender finally came, the regime couldn't hide it. The Soviets broadcast it. The BBC broadcast it. Foreign newspapers carried it. The Sixth Army was gone. Sambai Sensha. Lingo Lehman. In 3 months. For a destiny that had promised 1,000 years. Joseph Goebbels was probably the most effective propagandist of the 20th century. He understood, within hours of the Stalingrad surrender, what it meant for the narrative. He couldn't deny the loss. He couldn't minimize it. But he could do something that sounds impossible. He could use it. 16 days later, at the Sportpalast, he stood in front of 14,000 carefully chosen Germans, people who would respond the way he needed and ask the question, do you want total war? Do you want it? If necessary. More total and more radical than we can even imagine today. The crowd roared yes. Here's something else about the Sport Palace speech that's easy to miss. Goebbels had the audience choreographed. The 14,000 people in that room were not random Germans off the street. They were specifically selected party officials. Wounded veterans, armaments, workers, people who could be counted on to respond the way the speech needed them to respond. The roaring yes that answered, do you want total war, wasn't spontaneous. It was engineered. The room was a prop, and it worked anyway. Because the speech was broadcast on national radio, the millions of Germans listening at home heard the roar of 14,000 carefully selected people and experienced it as the voice of Germany. Not a curated response, a spontaneous collective will. The sound of a nation deciding to fight harder in the face of catastrophe. That is the specific genius of the mechanism at scale. You build the appearance of consensus. You broadcast the appearance. The people who hear it understand it as evidence of what everyone believes. And then some of them start to believe it too. Because everyone else seems to. Goebbels noted in his diary that the Sportpalast speech was among his best work. Not for the ideology it expressed, for the craft. He was describing the engineering of a specific emotional and political outcome, using the tools of mass communication. The diary entries from those days read like a director's notes after a successful opening night. The technical satisfaction of a problem solved. There's a detail about the Sportpalast that makes the engineering visible. The questions Goebbels asked were not the only questions in the speech. He asked 10 questions in total, each one escalating. Do you want total war? Do you want it more radical than anything we can imagine? Do you trust the Führer? The structure was call and response, a format that had roots in religious revivalism, in the Protestant tradition of congregational affirmation, in the basic human wiring that makes it difficult to remain silent when everyone around you is responding. Each yes made the next yes easier. By the time the final question came, the crowd was already in a state of collective yes-saying that had its own momentum. Goebbels' diary entry that evening described the speech as among his best work. Not because of the ideology it expressed. Goebbels was too sophisticated for that kind of vanity. Because of the craft, the engineering of a specific emotional and political outcome using the available tools. He was describing the technical satisfaction of a problem solved. The problem: how do you take the worst military defeat in German history and convert it into a mobilization moment? The solution: reframe catastrophe as sacrifice. Sacrifice as invitation to greater commitment. And deliver the reframe to a crowd engineered to say yes. Think about what just happened. The greatest military defeat in German history, 330 000 men gone in 3 months was converted into a mobilization moment. Not a reason to question the war, a reason to commit more completely to it. Stalingrad wasn't the prophecy failing. Stalingrad was the prophecy demanding more. Germany hadn't lost at Stalingrad because the destiny was wrong. Germany had lost because Germany hadn't been giving everything. The answer was not less commitment. More. The evidence against the claim was absorbed by the claim. That's what Festinger called cognitive dissonance reduction. Goebbels called it Tuesday. The speech worked. German armaments production increased through 1,943. The population didn't revolt. There was no German equivalent of the Italian collapse that summer. The people who had been told they were the chosen inheritors of a 1,000-year destiny largely continued to behave as if they believed it, or at least continued to act as if they did, which for the regime's purposes was sufficient. You don't need everyone to believe. You need enough people to act as though they do. The rest follow. The private diaries and letters from the war's second half show something historians call a tonal shift. Not open door. Open door was dangerous. People were being denounced to the Gestapo, sometimes by family members, but something in the private register changes. Less of the confident energy of 1,940 and 1,941. More staying close to the immediate and practical. Fewer invocations of destiny, as if people had quietly stopped inhabiting the prophecy while still publicly performing it. The prophecy was still official. It was less fully believed. But the terror apparatus was real. The war still had to be fought. The machine ran on. April 16. The Soviet army begins its final push toward Berlin. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler is conducting the war from a table covered with maps. The maps show German military units Army Group Vistula, SS Division, Wehrmacht formations that are supposedly converging on Berlin to break the siege. Most of these units are fictional. Not on the maps, on the ground. On the ground, most of them are remnants, under strength, out of fuel, no air cover. Their officers understand the war is over and are moving west as fast as possible to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Hitler keeps ordering these ghost armies to attack, and his generals tell him the units don't have the strength. He accuses them of defeatism, betrayal, the Durchstoß, the stab in the back, the same phrase used after 1918 to explain the first German defeat. Germany wasn't losing because of military failure. Germany was being betrayed by internal enemies. In the last weeks in the bunker, the men around Hitler divided into two groups. Those who were still inside the narrative, who believed a miracle was coming, that the Western Allies and the Soviets would split over the post-war settlement, that the secret weapons would arrive in time, and those who had quietly exited the narrative and were managing the end as practically as possible. The line between the two groups was hard to see from the outside. In the bunker, everyone performed the belief the consequences of not performing it were lethal. Even in April, with Soviet shells landing on the street above, officers were being executed for defeatism. The performance of faith was mandatory long after the faith itself had eroded. This is the final form of the mechanism, when the prophecy has clearly failed, when no amount of reframing can make the specific defeat into a temporary setback. The mechanism still runs, on performance rather than belief. The apparatus of conviction continues to function after the conviction itself has died, because the cost of stopping the performance is higher than the cost of continuing it. The regime finally stopped not when people stopped believing, but when the Soviet army entered Berlin and there was no longer a consequence for stopping the performance. On May 2, Berlin surrendered. The 1,000-year Reich ended not with a final act of collective commitment, but with the simple cessation of coercion. When there was nothing left to compel the performance stopped. The conspiracy was the last form the prophecy took. If the German people were destined for a 1,000-year empire, defeat couldn't be the result of miscalculation or military imbalance. It had to be treachery. The prophecy remained valid. The people had been stabbed in the back. On March 19, 6 weeks before his suicide, Hitler signed what became known as the Nero Decree. By this point, the gap between official policy and actual implementation had been widening for 2 years. Local commanders across Germany were quietly making pragmatic decisions, preserving bridges, not destroying factories, surrendering cities to Allied forces before the combat made it necessary, not out of ideology but survival. They understood the war was ending and they would have to live in whatever remained. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the first intact bridge across the Rhine captured by Allied forces, in March 1945 survived because the German engineers responsible for its demolition failed to execute the order properly. Whether this was incompetence, deliberate non-compliance, or a combination is still debated. But the pattern was everywhere. The 1,000-year Reich, at the end, was being quietly disobeyed by people who had stopped believing the prophecy was worth dying for, while continuing to perform belief in front of anyone who might report them. Performance without belief is the mechanism's final stage. It keeps running on momentum alone, on the fear of what happens if you're the first to stop until external force makes stopping irrelevant. It ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure, all transportation, all communications, all industry, all supply depots, everything. The logic was explicit in the document itself. If Germany was losing the war, it had proven itself unworthy of survival. The inferior had overcome the superior. A people unworthy of survival had no right to the infrastructure that survival required. Think about that. The 1,000-year Reich, at the end, was trying to kill the German people for failing the prophecy. Not the enemies. The Germans themselves. Albert Speer, by then Reich, Minister of Armaments, quietly organized resistance to the decree. He visited the commanders who would have to implement it and convinced them, one by one, not to. He couldn't refuse openly, that was treason. So he worked around it through personal relationships and bureaucratic delay. He later said he was trying to preserve something for the Germans who would survive the war. He had stopped believing if he had ever fully believed and was thinking in practical terms about what a defeated Germany would need to rebuild. Meanwhile, Hitler and Speer had spent years planning the rebuilding of Berlin as Germania, a world capital for the 1,000-year Reich. The centerpiece was the Volkshalle, a domed structure whose interior would be 17 times larger than St. Peter's Basilica. It would hold 180,000 people standing. Speer calculated that the body heat and breath of 180,000 people would cause clouds to form near the top of the dome. The building was designed to generate its own weather. It was never built. The foundation test in 1941 found the ground too soft. The soil could not support the projected weight without settling. Hitler refused to redesign it. The project was deferred until after the war. The 1,000-year Reich ended in a bunker 5 meters underground while the city above it was being reduced to rubble. The Volkshalle that was supposed to make its own clouds was drawings and models in a hole in ground that was too soft to bear its weight. The prophecy couldn't find solid footing. Literally. Hitler married Eva Braun on April 29. Same night, he dictated his political testament. It accused the Jews of starting the war. It offered no acknowledgement that the policies he had pursued had produced the outcome he was experiencing. The prophecy had been real. The people had failed it. The enemies had won this time. But the historical truth of German destiny, the testament insisted, was not thereby disproven. He shot himself on April 30. Eva Braun took cyanide. The Reich chancellery above them burned. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 3 months. At the Nuremberg trials, which opened in November 1945, the surviving senior leaders of the regime were tried before a tribunal of Allied judges. 24 defendants, the men who had built and run the state. Here's something worth noting about how they defended themselves. Goering argued he was a loyal German officer following duty. Frank expressed remorse. Speer claimed he hadn't known about the extermination camps. Hess claimed amnesia. Streicher was incoherent. Not one of them stood up and argued that the 1,000-year Reich had been a real destiny. Not one of them said, "We were right, and history will vindicate us." The prophetic framework that had animated the entire regime, the claim that was worth dying for, worth killing for, worth following into a frozen pocket at Stalingrad, was simply absent from the courtroom, and the prophecy failed completely. No one was willing to stand up for it. The destiny, in the ruins, became unspeakable. Sebastian Haffner was a young German lawyer who left the country in 1938 after watching, from the inside, the transformation he'd lived through. He wrote about it in a memoir addressed to a British audience, trying to explain how Germany had become what it had become. His most famous line, "The question is not how Hitler was possible. The question is how we all were possible." He meant, the question isn't why one man was monstrous. The question is how a society, one that produced Goethe and Beethoven and Einstein, became capable of what it became capable of. The answer Haffner gives, and the answer this episode has been tracing, is they were offered a story that answered a real need. The need for meaning after defeat, for purpose after humiliation, for the feeling of being part of something larger than individual existence, chosen for a specific moment in history. The story was designed with extraordinary sophistication, the architecture, the film, the language, the youth organizations to produce that feeling before the critical faculties could evaluate it. You felt the truth of it before you thought about it. That's not stupidity. That's the mechanism working exactly as designed. The management plan for the Nuremberg rally grounds acknowledges something uncomfortable. The same physical space designed to produce mass devotion retains, for some visitors, a residual capacity to produce it. The architecture doesn't forget what it was for. Speer spent 20 years in Spandau prison. He spent the next 30 building a memoir that positioned him as a technocrat who had provided aesthetic infrastructure without really endorsing the ideology. Historians have found this unconvincing. His wartime diaries show he understood considerably more than he later claimed. But even as a dishonest defense, the positioning is instructive. The man who designed the Cathedral of Light spent the last decades of his life arguing that the architecture had been separate from the ideology, that the design wasn't responsible for what the design was for. There's a specific architectural detail that makes the scope of what Speer was planning concrete. The Volksschau, the domed People's Hall at the center of the planned Germania capital, was going to have an interior large enough that St. Peter's Basilica in Rome would fit inside it 17 times. It would hold 180. 000 people standing. The breath and body heat of 180. 000 people would cause clouds to form near the top of the dome. The building was designed to generate its own weather. Foundation tests in 1941 found the ground too soft. The project was deferred until after the war. It exists only in models, drawings, and the accounts of people who were shown those models and understood they were supposed to represent the physical form of a prophecy made permanent in stone. The ground was too soft. The 1,000-year Reich could not find solid footing. Literally, the Cathedral of Light existed for 6 years and is remembered for 80. The lesson it was designed to demonstrate lasted 12 years and is studied forever. The Nuremberg rally grounds are visited by about 350,000 people per year. The documentation center built on site received, in pre-pandemic years, about 250,000 visitors annually. The site is simultaneously a museum, a heritage site, a political warning, and for a small number of visitors who arrive with different intentions, something the curators did not plan for. The management plan acknowledges this directly. The same physical space designed to produce mass devotion retains, for some visitors, a residual capacity to produce it. The architecture doesn't forget what it was for. The stones don't change their memory based on who is standing in front of them. The question of what to do with it, whether to preserve it as evidence, restore it as a monument to what it was, or demolish it as a refusal to allow the prophecy any further physical form, has no clean answer. All three positions have been argued by serious people. With serious reasons, the site remains incompletely resolved, which may be the most honest condition available to a place that was built to make millions of people feel that the most destructive project in human history was divinely ordained. That asymmetry is the only honest memorial. Before we move to episode 3, 2 things to establish. First, the differences between episode 1 and episode 2. Manifest Destiny and the 1,000-year Reich share a structure, but the consequences are not on the same scale. The Trail of Tears was catastrophic. The Holocaust was a systematic industrial genocide with no precedent in recorded history. Grouping them in the same analytical framework is not a claim of equivalence. It's a claim about mechanism that the underlying structure that enabled both is the same structure, operating at different scales with different cultural materials. The mechanism is the same. The consequences are not. That distinction matters. Second, the specific contribution of the Nazi case to this season's argument. What Stalingrad gave us, what Goebbels' Sportpalast speech demonstrated with almost laboratory clarity, is what the mechanism does when the evidence against it becomes impossible to ignore. It doesn't collapse. It absorbs. It reframes the catastrophe as a call for deeper commitment. It makes the disconfirmation into evidence that the mission was even more necessary than previously understood. Festinger documented this in 1956 with 12 people in a cult in suburban Illinois. Goebbels practiced it in 1943 with a nation in the middle of a world war. The cognitive structure was identical. Scale doesn't change the mechanism. The parallel between Manifest Destiny and the 1,000-year Reich is structural, not moral. Placing them in the same analytical framework is a claim about mechanism, the same underlying architecture of gap. Filling. Unfalsifiable claim. Erasure of those who bear the costs, not a claim about equivalence of consequences. The Trail of Tears was catastrophic. The Holocaust was singular. Both things are true. And they were produced by the same kind of mechanism operating with different materials. At different scales. In different political and cultural contexts. The mechanism is what this season exists to document. The consequences are what remind you why the documentation matters. It just changes the body count. Hannah Arendt. Writing 6 years after the war ended, Sebastian Haffner was 20 years old when Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. He was studying law, intending to become a judge. He describes in his memoir the specific moment when the normal world ended, not a dramatic moment of violence, but a bureaucratic one. He was in a law library, preparing for an exam, when essaymen came in, checked everyone's identity papers, and ordered all Jews to leave. The Jewish law students left, the non-Jewish students, including Haffner, remained. And then, he writes. He went back to work on his notes. That moment going back to the notes became, in his retrospective account, the moment he identified as the central failure. Not the SA men. Not the legal system that was already being dismantled. The moment when an ordinary person accepted an extraordinary violation as the new normal and returned to their routine. The mechanism doesn't require dramatic conversion. It requires the accumulation of small acceptances, each one making the next easier, until the destination that would have been unthinkable at the start is simply where you are. Hafner eventually refused his own small acceptances. He left Germany in 1938 with his Jewish girlfriend, who would later become his wife, and began writing the memoir in London that he never published in his lifetime. He died in 1999. The book appeared 3 years later. It became one of the most widely read accounts of how the 1,000-year Reich felt from the inside, not from a victim's perspective, not from a perpetrator's, but from the perspective of an ordinary bystander watching himself become complicit and deciding, eventually, to refuse. The question he left open and that this episode has been circling is when the small acceptance becomes an unacceptable one. Where is that line? And how do you know you're approaching it before you've crossed it? The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. She wasn't describing stupid people. She was describing people who had been through sustained, sophisticated, multi-channel effort brought to a state where the standard tools for evaluating claims had been suspended in the domain of politics, replaced by a prior commitment so foundational that evidence couldn't reach it. The architecture produced it. The film reinforced it. The language embedded it. The youth organizations transmitted it to the next generation before they could question it. It worked, and then it failed, and then it was left behind. In the ruins. Unspeakable. Episode 3 of this season will take the mechanism somewhere very different. Not a European superpower with industrial infrastructure and a sophisticated propaganda apparatus. A cotton farmer in the Sudan. No searchlights. No film crew. No architecture. Just a man who declared himself the Messiah of Islam in 1881, and then defeated the British Empire. If episode 2 shows you what the mechanism looks like with maximum resources, every tool available, applied with extraordinary sophistication, episode 3 shows you what it looks like with almost none. Same structure, different scale, same result. The mechanism doesn't need Speer. It just needs a gap and a phrase. The searchlights were anti-aircraft guns. In 1934, they pointed up to build a cathedral. 3 years later, they were pointing up to shoot down Allied bombers. Same machines, same angle. The function had reversed. That's the life cycle of a prophetic weapon. It begins as spectacle. It ends as what it was always also preparing to become. The light that was supposed to demonstrate divine favor becomes the beam reaching for the planes that are coming to reduce the city to rubble. The 1,000-year Reich promised a ceiling of light. What it delivered was 12 years in a sky full of fire.